Okay, so I met you, what, a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago
Yeah.
now?
Yeah, it was about a week
Um,
and a half ago.
my dad, he grew up in Boston. He grew up in a very racist city. When he left Boston, he moved to Seattle, actually, and he finished his university there. Um, he didn't know a lot about the Black community, and so when I came to visit you all a couple weeks ago, I wanted to learn more. Can you give me more context about the central area of Seattle and why that
Oh,
was the Black part
yes.
of town?
Oh, yes, 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 indeed. I can remember my mom moved from Louisiana along with her sister, and 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 during this period, I'm not sure what was going on with my mom because I left her to live with her sister, my aunt, and we grew up in Holly Park for at least I grew up in Holly Park for at least about 2 years. And I can remember my first day at Van Assel, which is a local school near Holly Park. And I was there for about 2 months, and my mom came and she said, "We're moving to the central area." She had just bought a house, and at that time, believe it or not, her home cost $5,400 or something like that. And so I moved to the central area and grew went to school at Horace Mann. And what I remember about the central area is that it was going through a period, nowadays they call it gentrification, but it was like this migration of black folks and Asians coming into the central area, primarily because it was redlined. I mean, that's where folks could move, and affordable housing at that time was in the central area. So central area swiftly became a black community in which there were lots of riches that I would define in this culture, uh, lots of black businesses. There was this neighborly relationship where everyone seemed to ask the same question, particularly to me, like, "How your grades? Are you doing right? Are you going to school and acting right?" Those kinds of questions. Those were normative in helping all children do the best they could while going to school like Horseman.
So I'm curious, why did Seattle want to integrate the city? What were the racial dynamics like in the late 60s, early 70s?
Well, interesting enough, um, there was an article in the newspaper last week about Seattle's focus to desegregate. And interesting enough, it also said that today it's worse than it was in the 70s. And so when examining the reasons, for the most part, it could have been neighborhood. Um, and and I want to say that I really feel that, right after, there was a southern movement to integrate, and I think it's kind of migrated up north, and folks were saying it's the right thing to do. And as a result, uh, there was an initiative to recruit black folks who are living in the neighborhood to go to white schools. And I think it started relatively at a very slow pace. And as I mentioned before, it just felt like for me, to play football was the greatest interest that I had at that time. So that's why I participated.
Yeah, how old were you generally, and what did you think about integration when you were, a
Well,
teenager?
I it was a friend of mine who unfortunately is no longer with us, but we were like best buddies, and we both had this desire to play football. Once again, we couldn't make the Garfield football team, so we said at 16 years old, we're out of here. And so I didn't have, nor did he have a real desire or have a belief that we were doing something that was monumental by integrating schools. We just wanted to play football. And when I got there, it was it was a cultural shift because at Cleveland, it was primarily white and Asian. And I was coming from a school that was primarily African American at that time.
Yeah, do you remember any stories, any scenes about integrating into a wider school? Did you see any racism? Did you face anything?
Well, for me, um, and I'll talk personally, it was this shift that when I left Garfield, and I also want to reflect on the middle school experience because there I spent 3 years. And I always felt like I was adequate and sometimes even felt smart. When I went to Cleveland, I noticed that for me, I started to shift from being active in the classroom to primarily hanging in hallways, doing things outside of the classroom that had no relationship to learning. And I also felt that there was a disconnect in regards to the relationship that I always felt when I was in a black school. And so, sometimes I sometimes think that even though integration was a big idea, not everybody who was part of the process necessarily wanted it to happen. It was something about the invasion of black folks coming into these white schools by which perception harm would be done. So if I think about the stories, my stories are really personal in that I didn't really believe that I was smart enough. And what we would do is often as black students would gather without creating a circle of individuals or students who didn't look like us. So even though we technically were integrating, we still formed our own circle and did not have relationships with those students who were of Asian or of European descent.
Did you try to enter those spaces though? Did you make an active effort or did you feel like you were inadequate?
Well, let me say that it depends on the circumstance. If we stayed isolated, as long if education was present, when we were doing social kind of stuff, uh, preparing for parties or that sort of thing, then we mingled, particularly with those students who created the initiative. We didn't necessarily take the initiative to bond. We just kind of kept in our own circle, and I think a lot of that had to do with relationships and not necessarily feeling like we were wanted. So I think the effort to maintain a close knit group was really important to our belief of survival. Um, Cleveland at that time had pods, had at least little small pods of adults who reached out, but it was often minimized by those that we felt didn't want us to be present. I'll never forget a story when in a classroom I was doing something, I probably was clowning, and this teacher, who I won't name, but I will say that her surname is all up in my mind, who said, "Come here, come here, come to the front." I walked to the front very slowly and I stood in front of her desk and she whispered so no one else could hear, "Donald, you'll never be anything in life." And it was such a shock to me that this teacher would say this that I turned around and meandered right back to my seat. And I think I laid my head on the desk, not wanting to participate at that point in time. So it was and that was my first year at Cleveland. And, as I may have said, it's probably a reflection of why coming out of high school, if there were 279 students, why I was ranked 259. And today I show my report card to as many people as possible so that it has a reflection on how racism elevates this belief that you're not able in circles where children are thriving.
Were you able to turn to your parents? Because it sounds like they might have grown up with like very severe racism in their life. Were you able to communicate with them what you were feeling back then?
That's really interesting that you asked me that question because, my mom was a big, 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 big. I don't know how many times I can say big believer of education, but she believed that everything in these schools was okay. She believed that school people couldn't do wrong. And so, even though I was operating or trying to function in a circle of hate, I would never tell my mom. I can remember even getting slapped by a teacher. Um, again, I had an affinity for horse playing, creating laughter in classroom. Rather than seeing that maybe as a gift, they saw it as a disruption. And I'll never forget this teacher who walked over to me and slapped me in the face. And I think I cried and cried and cried. Immediately, he knew that he did wrong. Immediately. But I never told my mom for fear that she would say, Donald, you did something wrong. But in hindsight, I should have told her because she probably would have stormed up there to that school and did some things that were probably unimaginable. But I didn't. I stayed quiet.
And, thinking on it 50 years later, 50-ish years later, why do you think you didn't tell her?
Um, back in the days, they used to teach folks how to spank, spank, spank. That's what they used to do. So I think the primary reason is that I didn't want to be viewed as someone who did something wrong, and of course, not to and to avoid getting spank, spank, spank for perception that she had that school staff could not do wrong.
Hmm. I want to talk about your football career a little bit. We
Hmm.
have this perception like whites and blacks are going to mix because we all watch Remember the Titans. What,
Yeah,
what was it actually like when you were on a mixed race football team?
you know, uh, let me say I also experienced the biggest disappointment in my first year at Cleveland because they said you had to sit out 1 year for ineligibility. And so I can remember Lonnie and I, he best friend, uh, we would go to practice, but we could never play. Go to practice, never play. And so one day we decided, well, we're just not gonna go practice because we can't play. The coach took it very personal. And I can remember during the following year, he made it a point that he was not going to start us for as a result of us not participating in practice. However, I just want to say that some of my best friends that I never even anticipated, who were of Asian descent, seemed to rally around that incident. They seemed to support us in not quitting again. And I remember that like it was yesterday. Um, how a few students stepped out of their comfort level to advocate for us. And as a result, um, we played. I think the coach may have listened not necessarily to us, but to the players who said they're better than bench players. And so, therefore, we believe they should play. That's jumping out of the comfort zone. And so, I dearly appreciate the effort to help us coming from the central area to Beacon Hill School, uh, to support our effort to fulfill a dream that we didn't think we could fulfill in Garfield. So that was it was really a great experience. Not in the beginning, but because of the relationships that we developed over time, it became very powerful in understanding that it was the young people who didn't have the issue of hate, didn't have the issue of we're better than you. It was the adults who carried that theme to the classroom and to other environments by which Black children existed.
So how did you persevere through that? I know that sports is a way to like build confidence and find who you are. I played a lot of sports growing up. I definitely found my confidence there. Where did you find your confidence when you were in school?
I hate saying all of this on the radio, but I think it was that the social interactions with people who like to party. I hate saying all that, but I just think that uh, I will never, ever, ever, ever blame the outcomes of my high school experiences on the adults because I think over time I should have known better. Looking back, but I would say that my confidence, believe it or not, occurred joining a choir. My confidence occurred in the home ec classes, and my confidence occurred hanging out in the hallways with people who had some of the same desires, the same in the same way we like to have fun. Uh, and so, so in many cases, I consider myself a big old fish in a little teeny pond, hanging out with people who were just like me, felt like me, and uh, you know the when you have me reflect on some of these questions, the hurt that I sometimes have is that many of my classmates are no longer with me. Um, so it was like when I went to my 50th, I think it was 50th reunion not long ago. There were so many people whose names were on the table that to this day I would say I love, but are no longer present. They're just in my memory. Um, but that's what kept me going in school to at least complete my last year as a senior.
Did you feel a responsibility then, and then knowing that you're one of the few of your core group who has remained? Do you feel a responsibility now to share these stories?
I feel it's a responsibility for me to share these stories with children in schools that are struggling, just like I kind of struggled. But, I said earlier that it didn't feel like I had a struggle when I was in the central area schools. I felt as if everybody could read. I felt like everybody wanted to do math. It just felt like everybody had a desire to be smart. The shift came at 16 when I ended up at Cleveland, and it just became a new way of living that was different than how I grew up. So, when I think about responsibility, I believe that sharing my experience with children and even the adults who are teaching children, it becomes important to me because I think I, I'm a living legacy, so to speak, in which I could talk about my pain, my struggles, and even share artifacts of my experiences so that children can get a picture of why they don't want to follow my journey. And what I also love to do is share experiences with teachers just so that they know the impact that they can have on one child. And the reason that I say that is because I had similar experiences even at the University of Washington. As you can imagine, that was the civil rights period. And so, even though there was this public schools had this notion that we need to integrate, so did the University of Washington in 1968. That's when they had the civil rights movement. So even though I was coming out of school with these very poor grades, I still had the opportunity to go to the University of Washington. And sometimes I go, because even in even in that experience, in that arrangement, in those venues, it was worse than high school. And the same thing happened on the college campus as it did at Cleveland High School. We would congregate, we would go into the lower quarters, the bowels of the hub, and play cards all day long. So there wasn't much difference between college and high school. And and the only reason why I shifted probably had more to do with receiving a letter saying you must want to go to Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a kind of like a real wake up for me. And that's when I began to look at my life personally in relationship to how do I take responsibility for my own performance. But here was the key. There was a Mexican American, and he was he was like my source for saying, Donald, you can. So what I had lost in high school, I regained through his vision of who I could become. And he worked with me as a mentor so that I could figure out how to study. Uh, and I had two or three professors who were like that. And so it gives me reason to say that relationships are so important. And if you're going to do this integration stuff, because I think I may have said that I felt a circle of hate when going into a school where people say that we were invading versus adults who would take the opportunity to develop the relationships, see the best in of what I could offer, and nurture that and plant seeds by which I could grow them to see my own accomplishments. And so
Mm-hmm.
I just want to say that um, I still see this quandary of where people sometimes think that Black students and students who have the perception of struggle, there's this need not to allow. But my experiences in schools also indicate that when there's this notion that all children are precious, all children should have the opportunity to contribute, I just see lots of magic. So the legacy is I'm trying to identify what those strategies are and then spread them from one teacher to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next.
And you said you got the UW in '68, is that right?
68.
So you were there when Martin Luther King died, or just after?
Uh-huh. That's right.
And then Stokely Carmichael was starting to become a much bigger presence. What was it like being, 18, 19-year-old during that period when Black
Oh,
Power was beginning?
well, you making me smile because I left Cleveland to return to Garfield when Stokely Carmichael came to give a speech. And I'll never forget the moment that everybody in the audience moved from being a Negro to being Black. And not only did we do that perception, there's this internal perception that we are Black because of his speech, But we actually, I can remember running out of the auditorium onto the streets, hollering, "We are black." Just like we were at some sort of a rally or a protest. We are black. It was this announcement that there was something bigger than we imagined. And but it was also troubled times too, because that's when a lot of protests also took place. And matter of fact, right after Stokely Carmichael gave his speech, right down 23rd, that's where you saw a lot of protests uh,
Mm.
and stopping of traffic. Um, Even looking at how we could damage property. I mean, there was something about what we had learned that we had to go do some demonstrations and all that kind of stuff. And I was all up in the hype. And that hype went from the streets to the campus of the University of Washington. Not during the same period of time, but upon our entry when we were seeking equal opportunity. And that opportunity surfaced uh, when uh, became very clear that teachers, just like in Cleveland, thought we were invading because of affirmative action.
Mm.
So this whole issue of desegregation, integration, uh, should always be marked by the thought that Black folks were invading territory that whites believed was very precious and solely meant for them.
And something you brought up a couple weeks ago, this is all cyclical. Like this happens again and again. These same issues pop up. Like
Yes,
we're
yeah.
going through the Black Lives Matter movement right now. From where you have come from and the career you've had, what advice do you have for blacks going through a very similar time right now?
Well, if you listen to my story, you probably didn't hear me say or talk about anything associated with culture. You didn't hear me mention anything of that nature. And so when I spend my time talking to my young brothers or my young sisters, I talk about the importance of understanding that in my time here on earth, I have gone through 3 or 4 stages. One is when my father was known as Boy, um, when the N word was frequently used during his period of time, and I could see his face of shame because he knew I was standing by his side when such words were used. Um, I would also talk about, I was talking about the stages that I've gone through, uh, where when I look on my birth certificate, I see Negro. And then I mentioned Stokely Carmichael when we came out and said Black. And then we went through another stage when we were called African Americans. And when you think about in 73 years, those 4 stages, you can sometimes understand why I might be lost. Because what we have learned is that in this case, Negro has no landmass to really define my ancestral lineage. Black, quite frankly, became a culture here, but it doesn't attach myself to uh, my ancestors from which they've come. And what I've learned over time is that public schools, because of the invasion, the notion of invasion, never took time to introduce the magnificent victories of blacks to help grow this country. Thus, I believe everything that was associated with white accomplishments that I was not part of. So when talking with students, teachers, I stress the importance of helping students, all students, develop a rich culture. And I'm even talking about white students because there's no landmass named white. So when we begin to think about the construction of race, what we see that we were hokey doke led to this belief that race was the most important construct in one's development. So if you were black, not likely to obtain what white folks were obtaining. And then on the other hand, for white folks, they seem to believe that being white, losing who they are, gave them a group of privileges that led them to believe that I'm better than you. Thus, you got invasion coming into my territory, interrupting my privileges. And so, I just think that it's like it's helping folks understand the importance of a belonging environment. It's helping people understand, regardless of my perceptions, we need to welcome every student into an environment which has a responsibility for helping people develop. I also believe that it's our parents, because what I see sometimes is that our children have the makeup of their parents who have been oppressed and, in fact, have been traumatized by a system that says, I'm better than you. And so that's institutionalized across all systems, right? And so if this self-fulfilling prophecy is defined by what I exist in, then I become what you set out for me to be. And so the goal in my mind is to interrupt these systems and to really remove the abstract of what racism is and break it down to you trying to create a system where that you believe you better than me. And when I go into schools, it's about creating this platform, this landscape where even though you might be smarter than me in math, I have a responsibility to help you become just like me. That is the deconstruction of racism, where everybody believes that they have a responsibility to create healthy environments. So if we're really, and I'm going to go back to this integration again, if we're really believing that it's important, if we think that integration is about people occupying space, then that's a falsehood that will continue to lead to bad outcomes. Inviting people into space means that somebody has made a decision to allow everyone to thrive. Thus, conditions have to be recognized to understand what promotes the opportunities for allowing all children to thrive, to be the best of themselves. And often we do not take into consideration, because of privileges, this is what I naturally get, take the opportunity to understand what children need, coming from environments that are unlike others. So I try to model that behavior. I talk about my behavior. I bring artifacts to the situation. The individual, Delbert Richardson, who I was with the other day, uh, has this traveling museum that speaks volumes to what children should be proud of in regards to what their ancestors created. It creates this belief I can be somebody. It's also an opportunity, in spite the oppression. I mean, because I think I'm one of those examples. In spite the oppression that I face from, and I want to say from the time I left Garfield to go to Cleveland, somehow or another in that journey, I was living in the skills that I think I was blessed with. And then when I got to University of Washington, because of a few folks, I was able to open other doors so that I could experience an arrangement where I could teach others.
I'm
And
curious though, because I want to ask you this because I hear you on creating spaces where people can bring their cultures and we can find, like a shared path forward. But what happens when communities don't want to even teach Black history? They call it critical race theory. They don't want to value your history.
mhm,
How do you find belonging in an experience like that?
you may not, and you may not. That's why I think it's so important to create other spaces by which children can grow into their own. Um, and so I talk about why don't we have Saturday school? Just like you see uh, my Asian brothers and sisters do. Why don't we have? Why don't we have like church is such a big deal in the Black community? Why don't we reframe the purpose of church, the purpose of religion, spirituality, so that if that's a source or a place where people go, well, we really begin to help people heal from the conditions that they live in 6 days of the week. We really put a focus in on one's affirmative right here on earth. So, because church sometimes, in my mind, creates this belief that one day, and I'm saying that we need to work in this day as we prepare for one day. And so I think that I've never believed, particularly after I got out of college, that public education was the only source by which our children should thrive. So even though these spaces exist, I also know that I must enter those spaces regardless of the conditions. Thus, I have to prepare students to be self advocates, to go into those spaces that are oppressive, because there's something in that space that I may need in order to benefit my pursuit to find happiness. Therefore, uh, like when you know, I hate talking about the worst of what I experienced at the University of Washington, but in this case, I will. Only to make this point that I also received a degree in recreation administration, and even to this day, and that's like 50 some odd years later, uh, that department had a will to keep Black folks out of that field. And I can remember with the degree in recreation, I was told that you were overqualified for a position that I was applying for. For me, in my mind, when you say overqualified, that's something that I should determine, not not the person who sits in a seat of decision making. But more importantly, I remember one teacher. There were four Black folks in this class. We were always ranked at the bottom of every single test that was given. Four, four of us. I was always at the top of the Black folks because I think he liked me a little bit better than the other three. But one day, there was this white fella who eventually became my best friend. And he stood up in class because we made this arrangement where we exchanged papers. He had my paper, I had his paper. And he stood up and said, Condi, this paper that has an A belongs to Donald. Donald, I got my best friend's paper and got an E, who always got A's. That was an act that said, for this individual who took the chance of standing up for me gave me a new belief that I could go to any of these centers, any of those classrooms, and I could make it. Because not only could I then advocate for myself, but I knew that one of them young folks up in there would advocate for me as well. That's what happened at the University of Washington. And I'm saying that's what I see in schools as well. So when we really begin to think about integration, it ain't really about being with white folks. It's really about having this exchange of cultures where the appreciation of what we're offering that's different is so immense that I become this individual who wants to know more about people's culture, which creates relationship to knowing more in regards to reading, in regards to understanding how people problem solve given their oppressive conditions. These are things that I really believe that really spark intellect, that really spark humanity, that really brings about relationships with others who look different than me.
I want to finish up right here on this last question. We had dozens of people participate in this project across multiple cities. For the most part, people said integration has not worked. It was a failed experiment. What do you have to say to those people?
I agree. There's yeah, I agree. I agree with everything they've said. I think it in fact was a failed experiment because it only came from a few who had a belief that to it would create access to opportunity. It would create access to materials and tools. It would be the life thread for one's survival and obtainment of things that we say we couldn't get: cars, homes, clothes, all those things. And we believe that it was the integration of that would create the change. As I tried to explain, it's not the it's never really about the things. It's never really about the access. It's really about the relationship. It's really about the environment that people create. And I've said several times that folks felt that we were invading, and which then means I can't be welcoming to you if this is an invasion. So the reason that I think that and I'll also say this, because if you think about the end of slavery, there was this deconstruction. It was what do they call it? The construction period. What do they call it?
Yeah, Reconstruction. Yeah.
Reconstruction period. If you think about that era, that was a time when Black folks thrived because they created their own towns. They created their own schools. And then some notion said we could even be better because they destroyed what we had. So now, if we go into their systems, what would that mean? Well, it meant that we had regression. It meant that we now have a period of time where, even though we even got Black folks sitting in the head seat, the culture still exists by which many of our children can't read. Many of our children have a do not have a perspective for a worldview. They have a perspective for a neighborhood. And what we do know is that a perspective from a worldview creates the opportunity. So we limit it to the classroom next door.
Well, we're at time. Is there any last word that you have? Anything that you want to share?
Well, I really thank you for this interview. It's not often that I have opportunity to reminisce about my experiences from yesterday to today. And sometimes I even wonder how I moved from that state of uh, down on, you don't care about this, or that, to having a belief that I'm responsible for a family, to a belief that I have a responsibility to a community, to a need to gather people around me of like mind who want to build communities. And I think I'm very fortunate at my age, because they say some of us pass on at the age of 65, 67, and here I still am at 73, trying to make a difference with those who need the wisdom of yesterday's experiences.
And you are. That's why I wanted to talk with you again. Thank you so much for sharing your life and experience with us.
Absolutely. Enjoyed every moment.